Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 1 of Pol 101, American National Government. For our very first video lecture, I want to focus on one question in particular. What is the purpose of government? Each lecture, we're going to start off with an agenda slide so you have an idea of what it is we're going to be discussing in our weekly lecture. So for today, we're going to talk about what is the purpose of government. We're going to talk about the relationship between government or the public sector and the private sector and the different roles and responsibilities of each of these sectors. We're going to talk about the role of government with respect to how we perceive human nature. And then we're going to wrap up with some questions about how much government power is too much power. And how do we determine which rights are reasonable and unreasonable to surrender in order to live in a governed society? And I want to begin our lecture with a stop and think exercise. Now, you're going to see these pretty regularly throughout our video lectures this semester. And the purpose of these stop and think moments are to really serve as a launch pad for your discussion board posts. So generally, each lecture is going to focus on one big overarching question. And I'd like you to pause the video during these stop and think moments and take some time to write out your initial reactions and responses to the prompt. The rest of the lecture will mostly focus on presenting different perspectives and information about the stop and think prompt. And so what I want to see in the discussion board posts are your reactions to the stop and think prompts and how your attitude or perspective towards the prompt may have changed as new information was presented throughout the lecture. So for our very first prompt, I want you to briefly reflect on what you think the purpose of government is or should be. What does it do? Why do we need it? So go ahead and pause the video, take some time to type out your initial response, and when you're ready to proceed, hit play. Okay, so now that you've got your initial response written, I want to provide just a few more clarifying details about the discussion board, since that's such a big part of your grade this semester. So in your discussion post, I'd really like to see you analyze your response to the stop and think prompt within the context of all of the terms and concepts discussed in today's lecture. So in other words, I really want you breaking down your responses and trying to understand why the examples you gave justifying the purpose of government were top of mind for you. So when thinking about the purpose of government, did you mainly focus on powers of the federal or the state government? Did you focus on how the role of government should be to provide goods and services, or whether the purpose of government is mostly to keep us safe and protect our rights? Or did you focus on how the purpose of government really just exists to combat the worst elements of human nature and prevent us all from living in lawless chaos? Just be sure to take detailed notes throughout this presentation and compare your reasoning for the purpose of government to the ones that are offered here in today's lecture for your weekly discussion board posts. I'm really curious to see which parts of the lecture supported your ideas, or hear about which examples from the lecture you might have never even considered before, and how this new information now influences your opinion. Okay, so let's jump in. What is the purpose of government? Well, first, whether we realize it or not, we are constantly interacting with government in our daily lives. From the food we eat for breakfast, to the roads we drive on, the services we provide at our jobs, to the movies we watch, or the way that we interact with social media. The government plays a role in either providing for or regulating practically every conceivable aspect of our daily lives. So if you leave this class with anything, I want you to truly understand the enormity of responsibility that falls on the government in its pursuit to provide each of us with the rights, privileges, and freedoms that we expect in our daily lives. And in fact, one of the biggest debates we have in this country is whether it should be the government's responsibility to provide all of these services, or if we should let private entities and corporations take on more responsibility to help reduce the workload of the federal government. But more on that later. First, let's talk about one of the biggest responsibilities of government: providing and regulating goods. And there's two types of goods that we need to be aware of. First, we have public or non-excludable goods. These are products that can be consumed without reducing their availability. Second, there are things called private or excludable goods, which are products that must be purchased and have limited consumability. So I'd actually like you to go ahead and pause the video for a second, and I'm curious if you can think of at least one example of a public non-excludable good and an example of a private or excludable good. Because public goods are services that are available to everyone in society, individuals are able to share and consume these goods simultaneously without reducing their availability. In other words, just because I drive on the road today to get to work does not mean that there will be less road to drive on tomorrow. My use of the road does not reduce its availability. Secondly, because public goods are available to everyone, it means that these goods are also non-excludable, meaning that even if you didn't help pay for the road through taxes, no one is going to stop you from driving on that road. It is not excludable. Public goods are in stark contrast to private goods, which are finite commodities that are priced and sold to consumers at competitive rates. Individuals who cannot pay for the commodity are excluded from its consumption. These goods are produced and sold by businesses through the marketplace. And these are things like going out and eating at a restaurant, purchasing a home, buying a car, cell phones, books, furniture, etc. And like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of debate about which services the government should provide and which services the private sector should provide. For instance, some people think that it should be the government's responsibility to guarantee things like housing for all 350 million Americans living in this country. And while that might sound like a great idea and one that would essentially eradicate homelessness, opponents argue that it would inevitably lead the government to ending things like private ownership of property, which would move us away from capitalism and more toward communism. Another frequent argument you'll hear is that the government has simply gotten too big, has taken on more responsibility than it can handle, and it's bad at managing money. And in order to fix things, we should allow the private sector to take on more of a role providing social services. In a nutshell, this is what many libertarians advocate for. So in this extreme view, this would lead to the total privatization of all public goods. It would be corporations, not the government, in charge of providing social services. We would have things like private roads, private schools, private hospitals. And we need to pay careful attention to the consequences here. When the government provides a service, the motivation for doing so is to provide that service to everyone. However, when the private sector provides a service, the motivation for doing so is to make a profit. Thus, opponents of privatization argue that if critical government services like roads and schools and hospitals were to be completely privatized, we as a society would likely become unable to guarantee their availability to those who need them most. In essence, we would price people out of their own society. And we're going to return to this topic in more detail later in the semester, but for now, I think it's a good exercise for you to start thinking about whether you think that there are certain goods that should be privatized or deprivatized, and how that might affect the state of our democracy. Now, besides the eternal struggle between the public sector and the private sector, there are even more problems that we need to consider when it comes to how public goods are provided in a society. So because public goods are shareable, non-excludable, and available to everyone, even those who do not contribute toward or pay for such services, there are some unique problems that are associated with providing these goods. And there's two in particular that I want to talk about: collective action problems and the free rider problem. So what is a collective action problem? That's a situation that arises when everyone benefits from a public good, but because of high cost, the most rational action is to not contribute at all, or to act in one's own personal self-interest. We can understand a rational action to occur when the total expected benefit is greater than the total expected cost. Now let's talk about two types of collective action problems: failure to coordinate and failure of outcome. And this picture says it all. If you have ever found yourself in this situation before, you have experienced a collective action problem, specifically a failure to coordinate collective action problem. So let's look at what we've got going on here. Traffic would be less prone to abrupt pauses and jams if everyone agreed to merge to the left lane well before the closure. So here in this situation, the maximum cost is sitting in traffic a little bit longer to ensure an easy merge and progression of movement where everyone would benefit equally. On the other hand, we have the maximum benefit situation, which would be just blowing through the right lane and merging at the very last minute, so you personally, individually, spend less time in traffic. And this process of maximizing your benefit at the expense of cost is essentially what a free rider is. Free riders are those who benefit from resources, public goods, or services of a communal nature, but do not pay for them, underpay, or seek to use the good in a way that benefits them more than the collective whole. The free rider problem is most apparent with respect to environmental issues. So, organizations that work to purify our air and clean our water, that undeniably benefits everyone. You reap the benefit of clean air and water, even if you contributed nothing at all to these initiatives. And if everyone had this mentality and did nothing, didn't contribute to the organization's missions, didn't finance it, right, the organization eventually struggles to survive and fail. And for that, we all pay the price. We can also think about collective action problems as a failure of outcome. This one will probably be really relevant to each of you watching this lecture. Imagine that you're part of a group in a class project involving research, weekly meetings, and a final presentation. Each member of the group has distinct responsibilities. So what's the maximum cost? It's doing the same amount of work as your partners to achieve a desirable outcome. But what's the maximum benefit? Well, you could just blow off the entire project, let everyone else do the work for you, and minimize your own personal cost. And so the problem here is that when everyone in the group acts rationally, or minimizing their own personal cost, the project cannot be completed. In other words, there's an outcome failure. So when everyone acts in their own best interest, they not only hurt the entire group, but they also hurt themselves. And now, even though we're all rational actors and we want to avoid doing things that aren't absolutely necessary, considering the consequences, it seems like we would want to do everything in our power to avoid these collective action problems, right? Well, actually, no. And The Prisoner's Dilemma does a really great job of explaining why we continue to act in our own self-interest, even if the benefit of working together yields better outcomes. So The Prisoner's Dilemma is a game theory thought experiment that involves two rational actors, each of whom can cooperate for a mutual benefit or betray their partner or defect for an individual reward. So imagine that we have two criminals. We'll call them Prisoner A and Prisoner B. They're arrested and interrogated separately. The police don't have enough evidence to convict the pair for the crime at hand, so they plan to sentence both to 1 year in prison on a lesser charge. So the interrogators offer each prisoner a bargain. If he testifies against his partner, he will go free, and his partner will get 3 years in prison. But there's a catch. If both prisoners testify against each other, both will be sentenced to 2 years in jail. And the interrogators then explain to each prisoner that there are 4 possible outcomes. If A and B both remain silent, they will each serve 1 year in prison. If A testifies against B, but B remains silent, A will be set free, while B serves 3 years in prison. If A remains silent, but B testifies against A will serve 3 years in prison, and B will be set free. And then finally, if A and B testify against each other, they will each serve 2 years. So what's interesting here is that regardless of what the other decides, each prisoner gets a higher reward by betraying the other or defecting. And the reasoning involves analyzing both players' best responses. B will either cooperate or defect. If B cooperates, A should defect, because going free is better than serving 1 year. If B defects, A should also defect, because serving 2 years is better than serving 3. So either way, A should defect, since defecting is A's best response, regardless of B's strategy. And parallel reasoning will show that B should defect as well. Defection always results in a better payoff than cooperation, so it's a strictly dominant strategy for both players. So what's the point? From a purely economic perspective, defecting toward one's own self-interest, or being rational, is often more appealing than giving up some of your own time, resources, or costs in order that everyone can benefit. And these economic models of decision-making and rationality help us understand why legislative gridlock or the inability of Congress to pass any laws occurs so frequently, right? This is a failure of outcome. It helps us understand why political polarization or extreme ideological disagreement is so pervasive in American politics, right? A failure to cooperate. So even though the outcome would technically be the best if both parties cooperated, the threat of just one of these actors defecting means that defection is always going to be the better strategy. So not only is it particularly tricky providing public goods with these unique collective action problems, but through the prisoner's dilemma, we can also understand how government agents themselves can fall victim to the same problems, choosing rational self-interest over providing for the collective. So you might think to yourself, sure, okay, from an economic perspective, we might be more inclined to act in our own self-interest rather than the collective good. But what about human nature? Haven't we evolved beyond pure rational self-interest? And how does the role of government change based upon our perception of human nature? And to understand the relationship between government and human nature, we have to dive into a brief summary of classical political philosophy. So imagine you lived in a land of absolute lawlessness with no rules, no punishments, and no security. How do you think people would behave if there were no guarantees of fundamental needs like food, water, shelter, or protection? If you had to fight every day for your own survival, what strategies would you develop to protect yourself? Would people band together to form collective groups of protection in order to better ensure their survival? And if so, how would these groups agree on what freedoms to give up in order to guarantee such protections? These are precisely the types of questions posed by the classical political philosophers we're about to discuss. They grapple with questions regarding the state of human nature, such as whether we are fundamentally a ruthless, self-interested species, or if we're more evolved than our animalistic instinct, choosing cooperation and sacrifice over survival of the fittest. And each of these political philosophers differed on their view of the state of human nature, which led to each advocating for different forms of governance as the solution for mankind's survival. So first, let's start with Thomas Hobbes, a 17th century English philosopher who's best known for his political philosophy presented in his work Leviathan, which I am going to do my best to briefly summarize. Let's start with the state of nature, according to Hobbes. Hobbes theorized that in a state of nature, without government or laws, human life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. He believed that people are naturally self-interested and in constant competition for resources, leading to a war of all against all. To escape this anarchic state, individuals collectively agree to form a society by entering into a social contract. They consent to surrender some of their freedoms to a sovereign authority in exchange for security and order. Hobbes argued that for the social contract to be effective, the sovereign must have absolute authority. This central power, whether a monarch or an assembly, must be strong enough to enforce laws and maintain peace. Now, the role of the sovereign is primarily to protect the people and ensure a stable society. Hobbes believed that a powerful, centralized authority was necessary to prevent the chaos and violence of the state of nature. And then finally, Hobbes contended that the legitimacy of the sovereign comes from the consent of the governed. However, he also argued that rebellion is only justified if the sovereign fails to protect the people, as the primary purpose of the social contract is security and order. So in essence, Hobbes's political philosophy emphasizes the necessity of a strong, centralized authority to maintain peace and prevent the destructive consequences of human nature left unchecked. Moving on to John Locke, he generally agreed with Hobbes on man's brutish state of nature, but disagreed on two major points. First, he introduces the concept of natural rights that also exist in the state of nature and can never be taken away. These are known as inalienable rights, which he defined as life, liberty, and property. Second, the social contract is not just agreed to among men, it is an agreement between men and their rulers. When rulers violate men's natural rights, the people are justified in overthrowing that regime. Now, Montesquieu objects both to Hobbes and Locke's view on the state of nature. In the state of nature, according to Montesquieu, individuals are so fearful that they avoid violence and war, not relish in it. Now, in the view of Montesquieu, it's resource scarcity, such as, lack of access to food, water, shelter, that causes timid humans to associate with others and build society. And once man enters the state of society, he loses the sense of his weakness, equality ceases, and then commences the state of war. In other words, according to Montesquieu, living in a society actually makes it easier for people to take advantage of each other. When government and society provide the resources we require to survive, we enter a state of war. We all compete to maximize our own self-interests. This is done both by the people and the government itself. So according to Montesquieu, this is precisely how absolute monarchies come into power. And Montesquieu argued that the best form of government is one in which judicial, executive, and legislative entities are separate or check the power of one another to prevent power imbalances. And finally, we have Rousseau, who argued that man's state of nature is free, equal, peaceful, and happy. It is society that corrupts man. For Rousseau, it is the rich, powerful elites who steal property from the common people and force them to accept their rule. The social contract is not a willing agreement. In his words, it is a fraud. Another excellent quote from Rousseau, "Man is born free, and everywhere is in chains." So for Rousseau, in order to stay free and protect one's natural rights, man must agree to give up their rights not to a king or government, but to the whole community. And this is what Rousseau defined as the sovereign. Accordingly, the best government, in his view, is direct democracy, which prevents the tyranny of the self-interested leaders. So those who disobey the general will of the public are thus forced to be free and no longer a part of man's civil society. So from Hobbes to Rousseau, these thinkers all share the idea that we are in a constant struggle between the desires of absolute freedom and the security of absolute rule. In other words, our desire to be completely unchained in the state of nature or secure and protected by an absolute authority. And we can translate these ideas to the spectrum here, where on the far left we have a society with no rulers, no law, and no guaranteed protections. Total anarchy. And on the right-hand side of the spectrum, we have a society that enables a sovereign authority, absolute control over the majority. This is totalitarianism. And it's on this spectrum that we see various systems of government manifest. So we have a direct democracy, a system of government in which policies and laws are decided directly by the people rather than a body of elected representatives. We have republics, which are systems of government in which a state is ruled by representatives of the citizen body. We have oligarchies, which is a system of government in which a small group of individuals like wealthy elites, intellectuals, or the military control the government. There are autocracies, where one individual is vested with absolute ruling power, and the people generally retain some degree of rights, privileges, and freedoms. This can include most forms of monarchies and some dictatorships. And then on the far right, we have authoritarianism, a system of government in which either one individual or a small group exert absolute ruling power, and they demand absolute obedience to their authority. Rights, privileges, and freedoms are most constrained under this form of government. And as we'll discuss throughout the semester, most governmental conflict boils down to questions of societal freedom. Should society mostly be free to do as it pleases? Or is government intervention required in order to ensure that everyone in society enjoys equal protection under the law? And so this question of societal freedom is just one of 3 basic aspects of government that I'd like you to know for the first exam in this course. And next, I want to briefly outline the terms and concepts associated with 2 other basic aspects of government. The systems that government uses to control our economic freedom, and also the power structures of various forms of government itself. First, let's talk about the difference between capitalism, socialism, and communism. So on the far left, we have capitalism. The government has the least economic control over the means of production. Most goods are provided by private owners. Class disparity is pronounced, and there's virtually no limit on how much a worker may earn. Next, we have socialism, where the government has more economic control than in capitalist systems, but less control than in a communist system. So here in a socialist system, individuals may own personal property, classism still exists, but the differences are small, and workers may earn more than other workers. And then finally, we have communism, the far right version of economic freedom, or I guess the least. Here, the government owns all property and economic resources. Class is essentially abolished, and the ability to earn more than the other is essentially non-existent. So here we see the same spectrum from left, absolute freedom, all the way to right, absolute control. And then next, I just want to give you a brief introduction into different power structures that governments can take on. First, we have a unitary system in which voters delegate power to the central government, and then the central government delegates powers to the state and local government. This is one of the most common forms of government throughout the world. Most governments throughout South America, Africa, Europe, and the Middle East have unitary systems of government. Next, we have federations in which the voters equally distribute power to the central government as well as the state and local government. Federations are often geographically large territories with various multicultural and ethnic identities. So we're talking about places like Russia, the United States, Canada, India, Brazil, Australia, places like that. And then lastly, we have confederations, where it's essentially the kind of opposite of a unitary system a little bit, where voters delegate power to the states, and then the states delegate power to the federal government or the central government. And although a confederate structure of government was the first system of government adopted by the United States, it's one of the most uncommon governing structures in the world. And this is mostly because since the member states of a confederation retain their sovereignty, they have an implicit right of secession, which is generally the main destabilizing cause in confederate systems. The states don't give the federal government enough power that it needs to successfully operate. So even though we started off with a confederate system of government, which we'll talk about in a lot more detail as the semester progresses, today American government is structured through federalism, meaning that the national government and the state governments share power. Now, some of these powers, such as ensuring national security, regulating the federal bureaucracy, and coining money, are express powers of the national government. On the other hand, issuing professional licenses, overseeing elections, and regulating schools, those are specific powers of the state. And then lastly, there are also powers that are shared or concurrent between both the national and the state governments, such as levying taxes, establishing courts, passing laws, maintaining law and order, and things of that nature. And today there's a lot of debate on whether the current state of federalism is balanced between the national and state governments. And depending on the issue, some argue that the federal government exerts far too much power over the states, while on other matters where the national government has taken less action, states really dictate policy in wildly different ways. And we're going to come back to these debates about federalism in just a few lectures. But for now, I want to leave you with some final thoughts regarding today's lecture, and I'm curious to hear your ideas about the Enlightenment thinkers in the discussion board this week, from Hobbes to Rousseau. I want to know which philosophy on the state of nature you agree with most and why. According to these political philosophers, the type of government a society chooses mirrors its state of nature. So I'd like to hear which state of nature you think most accurately describes American culture and society, and which form of government you think would be most effective. And to help get you started, here's just a couple more ideas that I have for you to consider as you get started with your first discussion board post. We spent a lot of time in this lecture discussing how the presence of government, authority, and rule requires that individuals give up some of their individual freedoms in order to be governed. In other words, we all agree to abide by certain rules so that society may flourish. And we create laws that forbid certain behaviors or actions that we perceive to be detrimental to the preservation of society, law, and order. But how do we as a society determine what is and what is not a reasonable right to surrender in order to live in a democratic society? I mean, most of us agree that we shouldn't steal from or murder each other, but beyond that, what criteria do we use to determine whether the government has infringed too much on our rights and liberties? And this will be a primary focus for many, many lectures to come, so I'm very excited to hear your ideas before we get to that content. But that's all I have for you today. Wanted to try to keep the first lecture a little bit on the shorter side. I really hope you enjoyed. Can't wait to read your posts in the discussion board, especially as we are, getting used to the online asynchronous format. Don't hesitate to email me with any questions that you might have about the class or assignments or anything like that. I'm definitely available for you guys here. So again, that's all I have for you. I hope you enjoyed. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.